Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. I am Katherine Troyer, and I'm delighted, as always, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there!
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited for you to join us today for our discussion over 1985's A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge.
Wahahaha. So we are going to slowly work our way through all of the Nightmare films. It's obviously going to take us a little bit of time to get there because we're going to alternate it with other episodes on other films. But what better franchise to work our way through than Nightmare?
Yeah, I'm a lot happier to be working my way through A Nightmare on Elm Street than I am to be working my way through the Halloween franchise that you're forcing me to do as well. This one brings me a lot more joy than the Halloween franchise, that's for sure.
As much as I like the Halloween franchise, this one brings me more joy as well, in part because it has a similar sort of affect to what we talked about with Evil Dead, where each film, yes, it's part of this larger story, but it really is its own sort of journey experience because it's its own weird tone and mood and in a way that like the Halloween or even the Friday the 13th ones are not going to be, right? Because they're a little bit more consistent in tone and mood, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I don't think any other film really kind of like articulates this conflicting view of Freddy, conflicting view of what is at the heart of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. There's so many conflicting ideas, and no film better articulates that than this second one.
Absolutely. It's such a peculiar experience, right? So the whole time I was watching it, I couldn't figure out if I really liked the film or actually really disliked it, if it was a rather delightfully good film or just the worst thing ever, if it perfectly embodied the essence of Nightmare, or if it was a complete deviation. Like, I could never decide on any of those fronts because this is just such a complicated hot mess in the best and worst ways possible.
Yeah, I could not agree more with you. I remember, like the original Nightmare, like I mentioned when on the other podcast episode, I grew up with Nightmare on Elm Street, so I've seen this before, but rewatching this one was a very different experience than rewatching the first Nightmare. This one is it's a lot more bizarre. It's a lot more of a confusing viewing experience, particularly viewing it as a modern audience, because there is a lot of, this is not a hot take to say this is a gay film.
Right.
There's a whole documentary about that.
Right, it's called the gayest horror film ever by a lot of people, right? So not a hot take.
Yeah, so this is not original, but it is interesting to watch this 1985's kind of like subtext of gayness and then seeing seeing how it plays out. It's a very interesting experience because every scene I was kind of switching back and forth between, I'm like, is this incredibly transgressive and progressive and the horror film that was needed at the time, or is this just homophobic?
Right, and the whole time my answer to that question was yes, right? Like, yes, it's both of these things, often at the same moment, right, and in the same scene. I think, too, the other question that I found myself just kind of saying, like, yes to was, does this film perfectly exemplify the spirit of the Freddy franchise, or is this a weird, very distinctly different film from the first one? Because, 1985, right, where this film comes out right after it. They, hopped on that cash cow as fast as they could.
I think I understand why Wes Craven would not want to come back for this film, because it is a very different depiction of both the dream world and Freddy, and it's very, very different what the creators kind of focused on as being the most scary, frightening part of Freddy. The source of horror from Nightmare on Elm Street the original to part 2 is drastically different.
Yes. And I think you can feel that unsettling, right, in the fact that, you know, they originally weren't even going to have Robert Englund be in it, right? And then
I know. But that's crazy.
Yeah, I can't even imagine, right? I just honestly can't imagine. And I think honestly, the film wouldn't have even had the sort of gay critical success that it has had if we didn't have Englund as Freddy.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, hearing Englund talk about his experience working on this film, he's one of the few actors, along with obviously Mark Patton, who talked about how he knew at the time that there was lots of gay subtext in the film, and how he explicitly made choices as an actor to play up the gay elements. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think if Robert Englund was not a part of this film, it would not be as gay, and also it would just straight up not be as good. Because, I mean, again, Robert Englund's back, thank God, and he's amazing in this film, again.
I got to meet him at a con here in San Antonio a few years ago, and he was hands down the nicest human being I think I've ever met.
I also met him at a comic book convention.
Wasn't he so nice? Wasn't he like the most delightful, down-to-earth person ever?
He's a total sweetheart. He's like he's exactly who you want him to be.
100%. Yeah, we mentioned that we had lived in Kentucky before, and he was like, oh, I love Kentucky, my wife and I. And then, like, he had this little story about him and his wife, and I was like, please let us be friends. And I think that, you know, like, just makes, for me, the whole experience when I watch these films that much sweeter, right? To know that Englund is... we've talked about this before with Evil Dead, right? That, like, you know, we've talked about how that series needed Bruce Campbell because Bruce Campbell is Ash, Ash is Bruce Campbell. And I would argue that, you know, you can't really have a Freddy that's not Robert Englund.
And I mean, the creative team of this film luckily realized that too, because they shot parts of it without Englund, and it just was not the same. I mean, Englund is a serious, classically trained actor, and classically trained in both, like, obviously the acting sensibility, but also classically trained in terms of, like, his physicality. He's focused primarily on that aspect of acting training, and I mean, you watch these movies and it shows, like, this is not just some guy putting on claws and, like, prancing about. This is a serious actor embodying this nightmare character.
Yes. And in a film that is going to be about the role that physicality plays and how we read certain people as queer or not, you have to have our monster be doing that same physicality, right? Because that's really key. And I have on my list of irrational fears, one that's on the super, like, what an incredibly irrational fear is the, like, I am terrified in retrospect about, like, how hard it must have been, particularly for gay men, to know if someone else was gay so that they could hook up with them back when, you know, you could at least more easily get arrested, right? You can still get beaten to death, but like, and how you'd have to, like, know, like, whether their earring was on the left or right, or whether they had a colored handkerchief in their left or right back pocket. Like, there's something about that feels so stressful to me that sometimes I just get overwhelmed about, like, how terrible it would have been if I had been a gay man in, like, the 50s, right? Which is such an unreasonable thing to be worried about. But that's really what this film is doing, right? Is it's showing us, like, where and how do we read that line of whether or not this is a leading man with a romantic female lead, or this is a leading man with a romantic gay lead, right? Romance. And that's an interesting thing for this film to do, whether or not it's intending to do it.
It's also interesting just considering the time period in which this came out, 1985. I mean, this is Reagan time. The AIDS epidemic is around this time.
Yeah. Like, and is being called GRID, right? Gay-related immune deficiency. Yeah.
This is just an interesting film to have been made and to be included as a part of the franchise. And it's incredibly divisive for that reason. I mean, there are this is kind of the film, if you are a fan of the Nightmare franchise, that some people single out as being their least favorite, because they're like, it just feels so tonally different, as we were talking about, and tonally, and even like from a source of horror perspective, different. I mean, there's a lot less nightmare elements in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 than in any of the other Nightmare films. And so I think it makes sense that this is such a divisive film, but it's also at the same time a lot of people's favorites because of a lot of these elements that we've already been hinting at.
Yeah. So I want to mention the theory that we've been like dancing around, right? Which is queer theory and the ways that impacts how we look at this film. And so I'm going to actually reference a gentleman whose name is Ellis Hanson. He had a 1999 book called Outtakes, Essays on Queer Theory in Film.
That's a funny title.
Yeah, it's one of those that you're like, you definitely spent some time making it work.
I am a firm believer that all titles for essays should be puns, so I am very, very happy that this panned out.
Yeah, honestly, if you can't have a punny title, then you shouldn't have a book. Is my there's my hot take. But so he talks about the distinction between gay and lesbian analyses of films versus queer theory. Whereas in gay and lesbian analyses, there primarily is this just sort of focus on gay characters, right? There are gay characters in this text, we're going to look at them. That queer theory tries to go a little bit beyond that by saying that it actually may not even matter if there are ostensibly gay characters, that what we're going to look at is not just the relationships between characters, but we're going to look at aesthetics and cinematic form and the complexities of desire and identification and the appreciation for political nuance and homoeroticism that goes well beyond whether or not there are gay characters, and genre and style and queer audiences as well. And a lot of people who write about Nightmare 2 really focus on the fact that it may not even, it really honestly doesn't matter in some ways whether or not the film was intended to be a queer film. What matters is the multiple sites of reception in which audiences have read it that way. And that's what queer theory does, and that's what I think makes this film so interesting, is that we have sort of two distinct conversations that are that cannot be separated from each other, and that is the film as text and the film as cultural artifact.
That is a great distinction. I'm really glad that you introduced this theory, because I think more than ever, like a lot of our conversations sometimes get bogged down in like creator's intent versus audience reaction, and I think that this implementing like this queer theory and saying like just this queer theory kind of seems to say that creator's intent doesn't matter so much as or it only matters a little bit, and there's all
it's only
of these
one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. It's creator's intent is sure important. They did make it, I suppose, or whatever. But there's so many other pieces that are at play rather than just like how one single, I mean, in this case, old white guy views their own text.
And I think it's because queer theory is aware of the intersectionality of identity in a way that goes a little beyond particularly feminist theory, or even more limited forms of gay and lesbian theory, because it's saying, you know, if we are composed of all of these different elements, then we have to assume that a film is as well. And so yes, what the script actually does, what the director did with his takes or her takes and wanted with things, that's a piece of the puzzle, but it is no less or no bigger than any of these other pieces. And I think that's why I struggle so much with this film, right? Because like you said, is this film like super homophobic, or is it like amazingly transgressive? And what we're seeing, I think, are the tensions between what the text is sometimes doing and what we see as the cultural artifact of the film.
So I guess now that we've got kind of the queer theory out of the closet and out in the open, why not just jump into these scenes within the film? I mean, I think while the purpose of this podcast is not to really examine the reception by the masses, because, I mean, this film has clearly been picked up and championed by the LGBTQ plus community. That is indisputable. But what we can really look at and discuss in the context of this podcast is how they got there. What pieces did they pick up on? Why this film? What scenes led them to champion this film?
One of the first things I think we have to think about is the character of Jesse. So we've talked before, we actually talked about it in our Black Christmas episodes about what happens when we have characters who have more gender neutral names, and the affect on female characters, particularly on the final girl. And so we have been sort of taught, starting with Black Christmas kind of onward, that our slasher films are going to end with a final girl figure who is going to sort of repurpose often very phallic sort of things to defeat the monster at the end. And a character named Jessie could have been just as easily a female character based on that name alone. But the film decides, and to very interesting effects, to have our final girl be a final boy instead.
And it's incredibly interesting because a large part of like the accepted theory around final girls is that they start in this place of clearly being more androgynous, but being identifiable as female. And by the end of the film, they have to, I know this phrasing is weird, but they have to gain the phallus object, in order to kill the monster. They gain the phallus, they gain the masculine tendency that they need to in order to succeed and win the day. And I really think that what is interesting about Jesse is that he goes through the exact same thing.
He does, and people like Carol Clover have explained that part of the reason that the final girl often ends up being very androgynous is because we frequently, especially in those early slasher films, the films were made for male audiences, right? And so it was how can we have a female character that the male audiences will still sort of be able to identify with. And so, yeah, it's really interesting because we're seeing that in some ways the character of Jesse is still a little androgynous in terms of the name, in terms of some of his clothing choices, although some of that's just the 80s. But you're right. He's still going through like a checklist, right? The things that need to happen.
And by the end, he gains the phallus. I mean, he does that in that dance sequence in which he puts a literal, like, wooden doodad in front of his crotch, and we see him literally have that phallus object right there. And then he also acquires the phallus through Freddy Krueger's claws, which had been previously set up to us in the film through an earlier scene to be an incredibly phallic and homoerotic paraphernalia. I mean, his claws are incredibly gay in this film.
That needs to be something. His claws are incredibly gay in this film. I mean, that should just be the tagline that you use.
They are incredibly
no, they super
gay.
Are. Right, and England even said that he wanted to go gayer, right? Like he wanted to even like insert it into Mark Patton's mouth, right? And that ended up being terminated, probably for good reasons. But yeah, now with that said, there's a really important caveat, and that is that the final girl is the final person standing, and Jesse isn't. You know, Jesse dies at the end after he defeats Freddy. I was trying to say Freddy and Krueger. Freddy, and then he's a crispy critter, and so it's his girlfriend, right? That is technically in that it's almost like a passing of the baton, right? Like that we can't. This character has been embodying this uncomfortable liminal space between final girl and a masculine character, and the film at the end is just like, okay, that was more than we can handle, so we'll just end with the traditional final girl who is a female coded as feminine, and just let that be how we end, right?
Yeah, the end certainly muddies a lot of the homoerotic elements that have been established.
Or maybe more specifically, the transgressive nature of those homoerotic elements.
That's a great point. the truly transgressive nature and the commitment of this final boy kind of thing. Because you're absolutely right. In the end, Jesse does still kind of, I guess, end up with the girl. The guy
there's a
gets
weird
the
sort
girl.
of like, the power of the woman, right? Which is not a new concept. If we go back to Victorian culture, the angel of the house, right, was used to describe the role of the woman to be the moral, religious, and all things other guide, right, for the household. And we really just kind of circle back to that, right?
And,
that we can save you if we have a woman's love.
And to indulge this point a little further, and indulge in perhaps a less transgressive reading of the film, a woman could save someone and turn them straight. Like, I mean, he was gay for a majority of the film. Freddy Krueger is the embodiment of him indulging in his gay tendencies, but at the end of the day, you put the right woman in front of a gay person, and bada bing, bada boom, they're magically cured and they're straight now. So that's definitely a less transgressive reading. That's definitely a far more homophobic reading of the film, which, based on what the writer has said, might actually be closer to what the creator intended.
But there are all of these moments in between. Some of the more obvious ones that we'll talk about in a second, obviously, like the whipping of the gym teacher. But there's other things, like, for example, one of the very first lines that the sister, Jesse's sister, utters, it's after he screams himself awake. And she said something along the lines of, like, why can't he just be like everyone else? And interestingly enough, at no point do his parents say to her, like, we wish the same thing, right? Like, there's this weird sort of acceptance, even of the dad, who's real crusty at times, that, like, he doesn't seem to be nearly as bothered by Jesse and who Jesse is than one might expect.
Yeah, he seems far more frustrated with, like, the more stereotypical dad things, like, oh, clean up your room. Why don't you ever be clean? Grr.
Yeah, it's not like, why don't you man up? Never once is that said, right? So it's really interesting how, you're right, it ends on this really untransgressive note, but so much of the film doesn't really show characters being upset by Jesse's character refusing to fit into a neat box.
Yeah, which is why I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I am kind of okay ignoring the end. The end, it was made that way because that's what it took to make a film at the time. We were obviously not going to see Jesse end up with Grady, so they, like, had to tie it up in a nice little heteronormative bow, and, like, tie that little bow on the top of the film. And so I'm okay kind of ignoring the ending, and instead focusing on the content of the film, what happens throughout so much more of the runtime.
I mean, we've ignored many endings of films that for us ruined things. So, why should this film be different? I think you're absolutely correct, especially when it comes to this relationship with Grady, because by and large, despite the admittedly rather large caveat of Jesse killing Grady, it's a rather functional, healthy relationship. I mean, so there's the like, it's definitely enemies to lovers type thing. Mm-hmm. But at no point, when Jesse needs a place to stay, Grady, of course, famously has that line of, like, you have a girl that wants to sleep with you and you're here with me to sleep over. But then he's like, okay, fine. Okay. Yeah. And they're actually a pretty healthy relationship. They're, like, kind of supportive of one another, again, until the death. But, like, we see them spend more quality time together than I've seen in some films that are straight up gay films, or rom-coms, or whatever the case may be, right? I've seen more films where I can say I've not actually seen the couple interact enough than Nightmare 2, right, with Grady and Jesse.
That's true, and I mean, their relationship is incredibly interesting, as is so much of this film. And just because I think of how the film chooses to costume both of them, really placing lots of emphasis on the bulge present in both of them to really accentuate and make the audience aware that these are two men. You cannot... The audience, there is no ambiguity there. They're not going to be able to just, like, put that out of their minds and just focus on the story or whatever. They're really confronted with the fact that these are two men showing affection to each other. And for 1985, that's pretty transgressive.
And I think, so the truth is that you can read this film as them having a romantic-ish relationship, or at least a homoerotic relationship. You could technically read it as just a friendship, right? Like the script does allow that if you aren't sort of reading all the other cues, right? And I think that's ultimately what I appreciate about this film is, Adam Scales has an article on Nightmare 2 and talks about the fact that this is a quote from him: "The film presents the postmodern disillusion of fixed roles, for Jesse is simultaneously presented as victim, monster, and final boy." And so he talks about the fact that, this film does what we have been taught is not the case in horror, and that is horror constructs all these binaries, right? The male sadomasochism, the female vulnerability, the monster, the victim, and in this film fractures all of that so that it is simultaneously a homoerotic story and just two gentlemen that happen to be really good friends. Like, it can be simultaneously read that way, and that is weirdly enough a strength as much as it is a weakness of the film.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is yet another relation back to the Evil Dead franchise, in which I feel this real strength of a lot of this film is present in the ambiguities of boundaries and borders and labels. Like in the Evil Dead franchise, nothing matters. Labels have no meaning. Any attempt to label anything is clearly presented as futile. I don't know if it is nearly as present in Nightmare on Elm Street 2 as obviously those films, but I think it's a real strength, nevertheless, present in this film.
And I think it's a strength that carries beyond the queerness of the film to the film's interpretation of the dreamscape.
Thank you for making that transition. I was trying to figure out how to make that transition, but...
I could see you, like, having the wheels, and you were like... and then you just kind of stopped, and I was like, okay, I can do it. I can make the transition. But it's true, right? Because one of the complaints about this film, as part of a Freddy franchise, is that it does really weird things with the dreamscape that no other... film in the franchise does, but certainly not the first one. And that is that this film is really presents a very conflicted message about how much bleed over there is. Like, can you be in the dream world and the real world? Is the dream world the real world? At what point, right? And like no better scene, I think, communicates this than when Jesse is dreaming and then like wanders into the gay bar, and then then the scene where the gym teacher is having him run laps at night, and then the gym teacher gets whipped to death. I actually had to rewind at that point because I thought maybe I'd missed something, because I wasn't sure if I was in the dream world or not, right? Because of course that idea of gym at night, that's like a nightmare that people have about school. So I was like, okay, well, this must be a dreamscape, because this doesn't make any sense. Like, why is this teacher doing this? This is so creepy. And then I was like, oh, he's being picked up by the cops. This is real, or real-ish, right? And it's very confusing.
Confusing, but in the same way that it would be confusing to Jesse in this time. I don't know if I have as much of a problem with this lack of boundaries and clear separation between the dream and reality, because I think that is one of the most interesting parts about dreams, is that sometimes you can be in a dream that feels so close to reality that you're like, this is real, and then you wake up, and then you have that like strange moment where you're like, wait a second, was that real? It felt so real. This feels real now. What's real? What's not? And that moment is, while usually very quick and fleeting, also terrifying. It's a terrifying moment of ambiguity and uncertainty. And I think that is the element of dreams that this film is like, that's what's interesting to me. It's the ambiguity in the natures of dreams. Whereas the first film is a lot more cut and dry. It's like, dream world, real world. This one really focuses on that liminal space between the dream world and the real world.
Absolutely. And I think that's why ultimately I came to appreciate it in a way that again, a lot of people can't, because they really like that clear sort of demarcation, where the characters, you know, in most of the nightmares, it only takes the characters a few seconds or minutes into their narrative story to figure out that they're in a dream, right? Because they're like, I'm in a boiler. I bet this is a dream, right? Whereas you're absolutely correct that so much of this film, I don't think Jesse, and therefore we don't know, right, where we are. And you're absolutely correct that not only do dreams bleed over when we wake up, but I mean, I've had moments where I started to recall a memory and then I realized it was a dream. Or one of my favorite restaurants of all time is one that doesn't actually exist except for in my dreams, but it's such a good restaurant. It's the best food ever. And I go there. It's so good. And I go there a lot, right? Because I have really intense dreams and I have recurring places in them, right? And so like there have been times that I'll begin a dream with like, ooh, let's go to such and such place. And then I go there. And so like there's so much bleed over and carry through. That you're right. It's a really fascinating way to depict the horror of not knowing literally as well as figuratively what's real.
Yeah. And it just really it goes back to that's all of these same things. The discussion of the nightmare escape versus the real world and the gay versus not gay element of the film, or to gay or not to gay, question within the film, they're the same question, I think. It's just whether or not this film is presenting no boundaries, really, and just presenting you that liminal space. And it drops you into that, and it's like, we're not going to give you all the answers, and that might be uncomfortable, but that's kind of the element, I think, of dreams and / nightmares that this film finds interesting. And I'm willing to go along with it for the ride, I think.
And I think I would even go so far as to argue that is the queerest thing about this film. That I don't know if this film would have had the queer following it does if it didn't have these very explicit things. Although, Wizard of Oz is also a beloved film of the gay community, and that one has even less obvious elements to it than Nightmare 2 does. But I think truly it's this film's celebration of the liminal and an acknowledgement that like is who we are. What is the line between authentic and performance? And the answer is there is no line, because everything is authentically a performance, and it is a performance that is authentic, right? And you're like, what? And I think that's what this film is giving us.
Yeah.
In a way that is so amazing to do.
And I think the parts of the film that don't work are the parts of the film that try to be more straightforward. Like the third act, I just think it doesn't really work in this film when it's definitively in the real world. The transition has happened. The boundaries have been crossed. You've entered that, and it's all in the real world. I think it's that last scene, particularly that at the pool, and
although some of the pool works for me only because it's so ridiculous.
I mean, it's amusing to see Freddy Krueger run around at this pool party, but it's amusing for like 10 seconds, and then I was like, this is not nearly as interesting as anything else that was happening. And I think it's just because it's a lot more straightforward than everything else that we've gotten in the film. And so those are the elements that don't kind of work for me. It's those more formulaic, straightforward, trying to give you the answers moments.
Yeah, I think it's once the film transitions and tries to like reframe Lisa as the final girl, right, who has to save her beloved, who like all of a sudden becomes action hero. She's like, I know exactly where he's gonna be. Like, you know, I think it's for me, it was really from the moment that she goes to the warehouse onward, right, that I found, and I realized it's a little short to be a full act, but that's where I began to have problems with the film.
That's the place in which it proceeds to undermine a lot of the really interesting stuff that it was doing previously.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode on A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. We will be continuing our exploration of the franchise, but we're going to alternate, as we do, between the franchise and another text. And so our next episode will be on
2020's Freaky.
Excellent. And as you tried to fit in many times, we will get freaky with freaky, which is not quite a pun, just repeating the word twice, but still there. In the meantime, though, we are continuing our Spooky Scraps series, which is just sort of all the stuff that didn't make it into the episode. And so for Nightmare 2, our Spooky Scrap is going to be on
Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a documentary that follows Mark Patton's experience working on Nightmare 2. So check that out on our YouTube page. Be sure to follow all of our social medias, which are linked in the description. Share us with your friends, and have a spooktacular day.